On this vote, the yeas are 192, the nays are 231. The amendment is not adopted. The question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, please say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Accordingly, under the rule, the committee rises. Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union has had under consideration H.R. 3964, and pursuant to House Resolution 472, I report the bill back to the House with an amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration the bill H.R. 3964, and pursuant to House Resolution 472, reports the bill back to the House with an amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole. Under the rule, the previous question is ordered. Is a separate vote demanded on the amendment to the amendment reported from the Committee of the Whole? If not, the question is on adoption of the amendment in the nature of the substitute as amended. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. Opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to address certain water-related concerns in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Valley and for other purposes.
The House will come to order. The Chair would ask all members to please take their conversations from the floor. The Chair would ask all members to please take their seats. Members and staff to please take their conversations from the floor. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentleman opposed to the bill?
I'm opposed.
The gentleman qualifies. The clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Garamendi of California moves to recommit the bill H.R. 3964 to the Committee on Natural Resources with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendment. Add...
You dispense with?
Is there objection? Seeing none, so ordered. The House will come to order.
We don't need that.
Chair would ask all members to please take their seats. Would ask members and staff to please take their conversations from the floor. The gentleman from California deserves to be heard. The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. This is the final amendment to the bill, which unfortunately will not kill the bill or send it back to committee. If adopted, the bill will immediately proceed to final passage as amended. Now, perhaps all of you have heard that there's a drought in the West. If you haven't, I'm here to tell you there's a serious drought in the West. Not just California, but throughout the West. This particular piece of legislation is said to deal with the drought. It does not. This legislation does two things that every one of us ought to be concerned about. First of all, it is a grab. It is a water grab. It takes water from somebody and gives it to somebody else. Secondly, if you're interested in states' rights, if you're interested in the power of a community to decide its own future, you better be paying attention to this bill.
California will suspend. Gentleman's correct. The House is not in order. The Chair would again ask all members to please take their seats. Ask all members and staff to please take their conversations from the floor.
This bill is very much about the power of a community, a power of the state to decide what it wants to do with its water. This is an issue of profound importance to every state in the West that has a reclamation project, because this bill sets out for the very first time the federal government overriding state constitution, in this case the Constitution of the state of California, state water law and contracts. This is serious stuff. If this were to somehow solve the crisis in California, you may accept it. But it does not. It does not create 1 gallon of water. It simply steals what little water there is available from some and gives it to another. I'd like now to give to my colleague from California, Ami Berra, 1 minute of time.
Thank you. Yeah, I speak in support of this motion because it will make this bill better. This is about protecting existing state law, and the current bill before us takes away state law. It's about protecting our communities, our local rights, our county rights. This motion will make this bill much better. It's incredibly important to the residents in the 5 Delta counties and the folks that I represent that they have water that they can drink. You know, this motion allows us to honor those state, county, and local laws and makes this bill better. I urge my colleagues to support the motion. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like now to yield 1 minute to my colleague from California, Mr. Huffman.
I thank my colleagues for offering this motion to improve a deeply flawed bill. California is home to over 100 federally recognized tribes, including over 24 in my congressional district. Many tribes, including the Hupa, the Yurok, and the Karuk in my district, depend on wild salmon as both a vital source of economic opportunity and a respected way of life. And
Gentlemen will suspend.
Query.
Gentleman will stay as parliamentary.
Mr. Speaker, while House rules...
Gentleman will suspend. Does the gentleman from California yield for a parliamentary inquiry?
yes.
Will it take my time?
It will.
I'm afraid I cannot yield. Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman does not yield. The House will be in order. Chair would ask all members to please cease their conversations. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chair, some of the water impacted by this bill is critically needed by tribes in my district. This bill explicitly waives state and federal law in a way that almost certainly would lead to additional diversions from the Trinity River, which would undermine tribal fishing and water rights. The Yurok tribe in my district has written about provisions in this bill that they would undermine the federal government's ability to meet its federal trust obligation to protect, preserve, and enhance the trust resources of that tribe. This House has an obligation to clarify that this cynical bill would not diminish any protected tribal water and fishing rights, and so I urge a yes on this motion to recommit, and I thank the gentleman.
Mr. Speaker, resuming my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman, Mr. Huffman's time has expired. The gentleman from California has 1.5 minutes remaining.
Oh. I was going to ask the chairman if he would yield.
The gentleman has 1.5 minutes remaining.
Sorry for the confusion, members. I want to be very clear with you. California water issues go back to the very beginning of the state, the gold rush. And as they've said, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting. Unfortunately, this bill does nothing to solve the current crisis in California. What it does, it sets in motion a series of pieces of legislation that will unravel 150 years of California water law and set in place extraordinary chaos. It does deliver water from one area to another area, literally stealing that water and giving it to others. It does override the California State Constitution and what we call the public trust doctrine. That is, the water of California belongs to all the people of California. It is allocated by law, by precedent, and by water rights that are allocated. This overrides that. We don't want the federal government to go there if you care anything about your state. about the water in your state and about your community. We need a long-term and short-term solution. Fortunately, in the omnibus bill, we did reinstate the federal drought protection Drought Response Act. We have many of the tools in place to deal with the drought today. What we don't have is money. I would ask the majority to put up a bill that delivers the money to carry out what is already in the law, which we did just 2 weeks ago. Unfortunately, this bill puts in place a new water war which we do not and cannot have at a time when we need to come together to solve California water problems. Mr. Speaker, I yield back what time I do not have.
For what purposes, the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to claim time in opposition to the motion to recommit.
Is the gentleman opposed to the motion?
I am opposed to the motion to recommit.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for any of you that were listening to the debate as we debated the amendment and the general debate on this, it is very, very evident that this bill is focused only on California. Only on California. And the reason I make that point, because part of the reason that California is in this situation is because of federal law and federal regulations. Now, one of the ironies here, there's a lot of ironies when you look at these motions to recommit. But my good friend, the sponsor of the motion to recommit, I believe, was in office or overseeing at some time when these water projects were passed for California. And here's the interesting point, because he makes the what is a valid point. One worries about preempting state law, but the Central Valley Project in California preempted California law when it was passed. Nobody heard anything about that then. The San Joaquin River Project preempted state law. I just want to make this point. No other state is affected. This is a California-centric piece of legislation. So,
Mr. Chairman,
now,
would you yield for a fact?
I will not yield to the gentleman. He didn't give me that courtesy earlier. I'm not going to give him that courtesy. Finally, this is the final point I want to make, and this is important. This is important. We heard the solution to the California water problems is embodied in this bill. It's similar to a bill that we passed last year with bipartisan support, I might add. We heard today, and my friends on the other side debate over and over, there are solutions. There's solutions to this. There's solutions to that. You know something? Nobody offered a solution. And furthermore, the other body in our legislative process has yet to offer a solution. Now, I can understand people not liking this solution. I understand that. But somebody has to give us something to negotiate with. That's what the issue is all about. We think this is right. We'll find out if it's right if the House votes to pass this. And then we'll go to the next process. But for goodness sakes, give California a chance to get a solution. And this MTR does nothing to advance that. Vote no on the MTR and vote for the underlying bill, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. Without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the motion to recommit. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. The noes have it.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from California.
I would love to set the chairman straight on the facts, but instead I'll ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman asks for a recorded vote. A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 8 and Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 5-minute vote on the motion to recommit will be followed by 5-minute votes on passage of the bill if ordered, and the question of agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal if ordered. This is a 5-minute vote.
We just heard some debate on this motion the House is voting on now. That's the last chance to change the California water bill before a vote on final passage of the measure. The bill would provide additional water for municipal and agricultural uses in California's Central Valley. Congressional Budget Office Director Doug Elmendorf was on Capitol Hill today testifying about a CBO report released yesterday that shows the health care law will reduce the number of full-time jobs in the U.S. by about 2 million workers. You can see today's House Budget Committee hearing with the CBO Director tonight at 8 Eastern on C-SPAN 2 and anytime at cspan.org. Here's a preview, starting with a question from Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan.
I have a few questions about the health care law and how it's affecting the labor market. What is your best estimate of the effect that Obamacare will have on the total number of hours worked, which is the issue we're talking about? I just want to make sure we accurately understand what it is you're saying.
Right. So we think that the Affordable Care Act will reduce the total number of hours worked in the economy by between 1.5% and 2% between 2017 and 2024 relative to what would have happened in the absence of that act.
What is that in equivalent FTEs, full-time equivalent workers?
So given the fact that the calculation that we've done to translate that suggests that's equivalent to between 2 and 2.5 million reduction in full-time equivalent employment.
So just to make sure everybody understands this, and I think reading the report, 2 million equivalent in 2017, 2.3 million equivalent in 2021, and 2.5 million equivalent in 2024, right?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
So just to understand this, it's not that employers are laying people off. It's that people aren't working in the workforce, aren't supplying labor to the equivalent of 2.5 million jobs in 2024. And as a result, that lower workforce participation rate, that less labor supplied, lowers economic growth.
Yes, that's right, Mr. Chairman.
So who are these workers? I mean, I know this is a statistical run, but who are the people typically in this category? What kind of worker from an income scale side are being affected by this?
So the effect is principally on the labor supply of lower wage workers. And the reason is that what the Affordable Care Act does is to provide subsidies focused on lower and lower middle income people to buy health insurance. And in order to encourage a sufficient number of people to buy an expensive product like health insurance, the subsidies are fairly large in dollar terms. Those subsidies are then withdrawn over time, withdrawn for people as their income rises.
Yeah, right.
And by providing heavily subsidized health insurance to people with very low income, and then withdrawing those subsidies as income rises, the Act creates a disincentive for people to work relative to what would have been the case in the absence of that act. Now, these subsidies, of course, make those lower income people better off. This is an implicit tax, not the sort of tax we normally think about, where if the government raises our taxes, we are worse off and face a disincentive to work more.
Yeah.
By providing a subsidy, these people are better off, but they do have less of an incentive to work.
So
and
I understand
they will respond to that by working.
I guess I understand the better off in the context of health care, but better off in inducing a person not to work who's on the low income scale, not to get on the ladder of life, to begin working, getting the dignity of work, getting more opportunities, rising their income, joining the middle class. This means fewer people will do that. That's why I'm troubled by this. Look, in your report, you note we're seeing a significant decline in labor force participation rate as the population ages. That's figure 2.8. And I'll just make a point here. This is what's so concerning about this is, if I understand your point, a big part of this is something we already knew, which is boomers are retiring. So we're effectively basically doubling the amount of retirees we have in the country over a generation, and far fewer people are following them into the workforce. I think, just off the top of my head, it's something like a 100% increase in retirees and only like a 17% increase in the workers following them in. So that's already a problem, where we're not prepared for the boomers and their retirement. But what this is doing is it's adding insult to injury. You're saying because of government policies, as the welfare state expands, the incentive to work declines, meaning grow the government, you shrink the economy. Fewer people are going to be working, and the economy will be slower as a result. We have about $1 trillion in less revenue because of slower economic growth from your last forecast, which goes to the deficit, to the debt, and makes us that much less prepared to get ready for the baby boomers and to pay off this debt. So that, to me, is just jaw-dropping. If you look at this budget, I'm rounding here, Social Security and Medicare nearly double over the window, the 10-year window. Medicaid more than doubles, but interest on the debt quadruples. Is that about right?
In nominal dollars,
Yeah,
yes, Mr.
right. So your baseline shows us that adding about $10 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years, which is a 57% increase in the amount of the national debt. At the same time, interest payments, as I mentioned, quadruple to $880 billion by 2024. Here's what I'm really worried about. You assume fairly stable interest rates. You assume a normalization of...
On this vote, the yeas are 191, the nays are 231. The motion is not adopted. The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentlelady from California.
may I request a recorded vote?
Gentlelady requests a recorded vote. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.
A final passage vote on the California water bill. KQED, a public radio station in San Francisco, writes that the bill is sponsored by the state's GOP delegation and advertised as emergency drought relief for farm communities in the San Joaquin Valley. The 68-page measure would roll back a wide range of environmental protections for endangered species, kill the decades-long effort to restore flows and salmon to the San Joaquin River, and preempt state water and endangered species laws. Those measures are all designed to allow more water to be sent from federal pumps in the Delta to farmers in the San Joaquin Valley. That from KQED as this vote on final passage continues. As this final passage vote on the California water bill wraps up, some of our live coverage tomorrow, in addition to our House coverage, on C-SPAN 2 we'll have the National Prayer Breakfast in the morning at 8 Eastern, with the Senate coming in at 9:30 to work on extending long-term unemployment benefits. And on C-SPAN 3, Politico will hold an event on energy policy in Congress starting at 8:10 a.m. Eastern. And a House Oversight Subcommittee will meet about the IRS investigation at 9:30. And you can join the conversation on that event at Facebook and Twitter.
vote. The yeas are 229, the nays are 191. The bill is passed. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the question on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the Journal, which the Chair will put de novo. The question is on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the Journal. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The Journal stands approved. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that when the House adjourns today, adjourn to meet at 9 a.m. tomorrow.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
The Chair will now take requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas rise? Without objection, so ordered.
Speaker, the House is not in order.
The House will come to order. Please take your conversations off the floor.
Mr. Speaker, today I recognize Jeff Teague, president of the Teague Auto Group in El Dorado, Arkansas, who was recently named Time Magazine's Auto Dealer of the Year. Awarded annually, this award recognizes the auto dealer who demonstrates exceptional business performance and distinguished community service. Jeff and his father opened their first dealership as partners 33 years ago in Walnut Ridge. Through hard work and determination, they built their dealership into a thriving family business. But more than a businessman, Jeff is also a dedicated member of the El Dorado community. He's involved with Arkansas Baptist Children's Home and Family Ministries, the Main Street El Dorado Music Festival, Union County 4-H, the Salvation Army, the South Arkansas Historical Foundation, and the Boys and Girls Club of El Dorado. I want to offer Jeff and his family my congratulations on this honor and thank him for all he does for the community of El Dorado.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Illinois seek recognition? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we celebrate Black History Month, I rise to honor a remarkable American, John Rogers, Sr., a man of unrivaled determination and intellect who led an extraordinary life. Mr. Rogers moved to Chicago at the age of 12 following the death of his parents and earned his pilot's license and enlisted in the Army's Air Forces, where he flew in 120 combat missions in World War II as a member of the famed Tuskegee Airmen. He went on to attend the University of Chicago's Law School on the GI Bill and served for 21 years as a Cook County juvenile court judge. He was known as much for his compassion as he was for his convictions, and believed as much in giving second chances as he did in doing things right the first time. Mr. Rogers was a great leader and role model. He passed away last month at the age of 95, but leaves behind a legacy of accomplishments that have made a greater America and are worthy of being celebrated in any month. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
To address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, Mr. Speaker, 4 years ago, the American people were told that the President's new health care law would create 4 million new jobs. Well, it turns out supporters of the law were only off by 6 million, because yesterday the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office reveals that over 2 million jobs will actually be lost under Obamacare. Now, one problem is the law drastically changes the definition of full-time work to 30 hours per week. Because of this so-called 30-hour rule, millions of Americans working in education, small business, hospitality, retail, food service, and public safety are now having their hours and their wages cut by up to 25%. And this comes at a time when there are already 7.8 million Americans working part-time who want full-time work. America's workers deserve better, and thankfully there's bipartisan support for the Save American Workers Act to restore a common understanding in America that full-time work is 40 hours. The bill passed the Ways and Means Committee and is headed for the floor. Mr. Speaker, let's have some common sense and eliminate this onerous mandate so we can get people back to work, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday in the Judiciary Committee, we had a very vigorous hearing and discussion on the questions of the National Security Agency and the privacy for the American people. I've introduced H.R. 2434, the Civilian Contractors Engaged in Intelligence Activities Reduction Act, which has seen a large support from the White House and others about the importance of considering and looking at the reduction of the outsourcing of our intelligence activities and really bringing in-house the training and the expertise of those who are handling America's intelligence. I introduced H.R. 2440, which is the Sunshine FISA Court in the Sunshine Act, which I'm very glad that part of it is in the H.R. 3361, Uniting and Strengthening America by Fulfilling Rights and Ending Eavesdropping. This is a bill that deals with the mega trolling that has occurred under the NSA and the business records. What America wants is security, but balanced with privacy and the respect for the Fourth Amendment, avoiding unreasonable search and seizure. It is important for this Congress to come together in a bipartisan way to stand up and be on the American side, American people's side, that we can secure them, secure the homeland, but we can also provide for their privacy. With that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back without objection. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Henry Hank Aaron is one of the great athletes to ever set foot on any field, renowned for breaking home run records and racial barriers. With grit and natural talent, he became the home run king of baseball while playing at a time of ugly segregation, having to sleep in separate hotel rooms from his teammates and facing countless threats on his life. On Saturday, a portrait of this extraordinary man, I'm proud to call my friend and neighbor, will be unveiled at the National Portrait Gallery as friends and family join Hank and his wife Billy in celebration of his 80th birthday. Cheers to you, Hammering Hank. Thank you for a lifetime of courage and inspiration.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise this evening in support and honor of the American Heart Association. Today, women, Democrats and Republicans, stood together in honor of the American Heart Association because we understand that cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer for women. The American Heart Association in stroke asks us to wear red in support of educating and giving awareness to the American people. We asked all citizens on this Friday, February the 7th, to wear red. Stand with us as we stand for educating and making our citizens aware of this killer disease. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to discuss the grave epidemic of heroin abuse. The media has shone a bright light on this issue this week, but for too many in my district, heroin abuse is all too common. The number of heroin deaths that we have seen in the counties I represent has been staggering. In Kane County, Illinois, there were 20 heroin-related deaths in 2013. In Will County, there were 35. And DuPage County reported 46 heroin-related deaths, including one period last summer when 15 overdose deaths were reported in just 17 days. Heroin abuse affects people of every race, income, and education level. These are mothers and fathers, friends and neighbors. Community leaders are working to fight back, and yet at the federal level, we have not only failed to increase our efforts to combat drug abuse, we have reduced resources. Funding for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration was cut by over $210 million in 2013. The DEA's budget was cut by nearly $120 million. Mr. Speaker, I rise today because we cannot ignore this epidemic which is ravaging our country. Thank you. Yield back.
Jimmy yields back. The chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leave of absence requested for Mr. Rush of Illinois for February 3rd through February 6th.
Without objection, the request is granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2013, the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Hartzler, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of my special order.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, today back in Missouri, this frigid cold snap is really making life miserable for everyone. We have below zero temperatures and wind chills and a lot of snow. In fact, a lot of children are home from school today. And you know, it's on snowy days like this back in Missouri and across much of America that we really appreciate the ability to go to our thermostats and to turn up the temperature and to be able to sit by a nice fire to keep warm. And what we don't need is the government interfering in that. You know, safe, affordable, reliable energy is vital for all of us as Americans, and it is being threatened by the Environmental Protection Agency. They are increasing burdens and making our regulations more difficult and costly for hardworking taxpayers. While I support common sense regulations designed to protect my constituents and the environment, many of the EPA regulations have gone too far, threatening to raise electricity rates during these cold winter months and hurting markets designed to provide rural homes with proper heating systems. County officials, farmers, city administrators, as well as moms and dads all across Missouri who have to pay the electric bill every month are constantly coming up to me with stories of the burdens that the EPA regulations have placed on their families, their businesses, and their communities. It's time for this to stop. It's time for the EPA to begin working with my constituents, with local officials, and with state governments to bring common sense, consensus-driven changes to their regulations instead of the typical heavy-handed Washington bureaucracy. Many of these regulations are stifling small businesses and local communities, leading to slow economic growth, stagnant jobs, and less opportunities for the next generations of Americans. So today, my colleagues and I would like to outline some of the most egregious EPA regulations and offer common sense solutions to fix, replace, or eliminate previous EPA actions that are hurting the average American. For example, the EPA's recently proposed rule on source performance standards for new power plants has raised serious concerns among ratepayers, utilities, and small businesses in my district. My main concern with these proposed regulations remains focused on Missouri's need to provide affordable and reliable electricity. However, in a state like Missouri that derives over 80% of our power from coal, the EPA has proposed a rule that would create a de facto ban on building any new coal-fired power plants by requiring the use of something called carbon capture and storage technology. This technology has not even been commercially proven viable anywhere, and the small private pilot projects used as the basis of the EPA's analysis have been highly subsidized by the government and are not commercially viable. Congressional intent in the Clean Air Act is clear. The EPA is required to complete a cost-benefit analysis and base their regulations on the best commercially available technology. It is clear that these standards have not been met. The good news is that there's a bipartisan solution for this regulation. Congressman Whitfield and Senator Manchin have introduced the Electricity Security and Affordability Act. They designed the bill to require that any greenhouse gas standards set by the EPA for new coal-fired plants are achievable by commercial power plants operating in the real world, including highly efficient plants that utilize the most modern, state-of-the-art standards that can be met by all states in a way that is not economically damaging to local ratepayers and small businesses. All we ask is that the EPA work with us to find common-sense solutions for real-world problems. Another example of needless regulation is the EPA proposed rule on future production of wood-burning stoves like the one in this picture right here. My constituents are concerned that this regulation could provide another de facto ban of the production and sale of 80% of America's current wood-burning stoves, which is the world's oldest heating system. The EPA's stringent one-size-fits-all policy goes against the will of the people, and it requires the same stringent standards in a cottage in the woods that it applies to high-rise building in downtown New York. For the first 10 years of my marriage, my husband and I heated our home with a wood-burning stove like this. And I'm concerned for the many constituents who have used these stoves for years to heat their home, that they'll have to turn in their old furnaces for scrap and make costly upgrades if they choose to remodel. So again, I implore the EPA to apply a little common sense to these onerous regulations and not finalize this burdensome rule. And these are just two examples of the many concerns of the EPA overreach that I hear on a regular basis. And I pause now to invite my colleagues to share experiences and issues that their constituents face dealing with this agency. So I'd like to start with my dear friend from Colorado, Doug Lamborn. Representative Lamborn, what would you like to share?
Well, I thank my friend and colleague, the gentlelady from Missouri, for her leadership on this issue, for putting this time together. This is an important topic. Mr. Speaker, I hear from Coloradans every day who are struggling just to make ends meet. Unemployment remains high, and Americans are striving to provide necessities for their families. Prices at the pump have doubled since President Obama took office. According to the Energy Information Administration, they are on a trajectory to rise even higher. Sadly, as American families and small businesses continue to suffer from these high energy prices, the Obama administration's response has been to impose job-killing and expensive rules through the Environmental Protection Agency. These expenses are passed on to American consumers. These policies, such as attempting to regulate greenhouse gas emissions through the Clean Air Act, only end up hurting consumers. As the chairman of the Natural Resources Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources and a proponent for business-focused regulations, I have been vocal against many of these harmful regulations. The EPA's continued power grab ends up taking legislative authority out of the hands of those who are sent here in Washington to represent the American people and puts it in the hands of unelected bureaucrats carrying out the agenda and policies of the White House. I have co-sponsored numerous bills to repeal many of these regulations piece by piece to ensure Americans that they would have affordable energy. Coloradans and the rest of the country should not have to choose between heating their homes and feeding their families. I remain committed to seeing what I can do to stop this bureaucratic overreach. Just for one example, and my friend and colleague alluded to this, the EPA wants to force American coal-fired power plants to use carbon capture and storage technology that does not even exist. Since it doesn't exist, this is an impossible mandate to obey. The EPA is basing its regulations on wishful thinking, not sound science. They need to be brought under control. The ability of working Americans to pay their bills hangs in the balance. I yield back, and I thank the gentlelady for putting this important time together.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for your leadership on this. You've been at the forefront of this, and this is so, so important. I love what you said about that the EPA is basing this on wishful thinking and not sound science. I think most of us would appreciate if there was some science behind regulations. That seems to be common sense, but they clearly have gone beyond that, and it's hurting, as you say, people, hurting the bottom line. It's hurting when you pay your bills every month and your electric bill is just going through the roof unnecessarily because of these onerous regulations. So thank you, gentlemen. And now I'd like to turn to my friend and colleague from Utah, Representative Chris Stewart, to share his thoughts on this important topic. Thank you, Chris.
I'd like to thank my friend from Missouri for allowing me to speak tonight, and thank you for organizing this. I think this is an important issue. In fact, I would say that this is a critical issue. It's a great example of why the American people don't trust the federal government. Let me say that again. The American people don't trust the federal government. So much of what they do doesn't make any sense. And so much of what the EPA does doesn't make any sense. I was the chair of the Subcommittee on the Environment. We had direct oversight over EPA. Again and again, I saw examples of the things that they did that illustrated that they were an agency that are in many ways out of control. At one point, they had proposed regulations over ozone that were virtually impossible for many western states to comply with. Western states like my home state of Utah. Their regulations would have been so restrictive that there was more naturally occurring ozone than they would have allowed. It doesn't make any sense. There are multiple studies that were sponsored by the EPA concerning supposed contamination of groundwater from fracking that were so sloppy and so obviously biased that even the EPA had to finally admit them and to withdraw their own studies. Once again, it doesn't make any sense. Why would the EPA try to stop fracking, a technology that has led to cheaper energy, more efficient energy, jobs, economic growth in many parts of our country? It doesn't make any sense. There is the war on coal that I suppose many will be speaking about tonight. That, as my friend Ms. Hartzler was saying, it drives up the cost of energy for every working family and does nothing to reduce global carbon emissions. But I'd like to take a minute and spend with a little more detail about what I think is one of the most egregious and troubling examples of EPA overreach. I want to speak on behalf of the thousands of landowners in my district, in my home state of Utah, that face a new threat due to the heavy hand of the EPA. This will affect farmers, it will affect ranchers, and even homeowners as they come into the crosshairs of an agency that has ever expanded regulatory agenda. These new actions from the EPA are nothing short of a power grab that will have significant impact on infrastructure, on energy, and land development. Back in September, the EPA published a draft rule to more heavily regulate the Clean Water Act. Now, make no mistake, this rule is wholly in defiance of recent Supreme Court rulings that determined the agency was out of step with current law. The draft rule would allow the EPA to regulate virtually every body of water in the United States, including private lakes, small ponds, seasonal streams. Every depression, no matter how far away it was from a jurisdictional water, could fall under this regulation. It would require farmers to get approval from the EPA before they planted their crops. It would require permits from the EPA before you could build on your own property. And it would hand environmentalists another way to sue property owners. It would drastically increase the cost and the time frame of building any piece of infrastructure, whether it's a highway or a power plant, all of the things that communities need in order to survive. Everyone agrees that we should protect the environment. There's a reason that I chose to live in Utah. I love to rock climb. I love to hike. I love to ski. I grew up on a farm. I love the land. I want to protect the land. But the presumption is that because I'm a Republican, I must hate the land, and I think it's absurd. If you want to take a meaningful step towards restoring trust between the American people and the federal government, then rein in the power of the EPA. It appears that our president has exactly the opposite in mind, and that scares me to death. And it frankly should scare every American. I hope that he doesn't. I hope we're able to control this agency. I hope that this discussion tonight helps move us forward towards doing that. And with that, Madam, I yield back.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Excellent points there. I think you're right. We need to make regulations that make sense. And what the EPA is doing does not make sense. And it does feed into the distrust of government bureaucracy by the American people, and well-deserved when they have some of these regulations coming out that they've been proposing that are harming Americans. So that's why we're here tonight, to raise these concerns and to fight against them. And I'm so glad today to get to pass the baton here to my friend from North Carolina, Representative George Holdings. So thank you for sharing your comments.
Well, I want to thank the gentlelady for bringing us here today to talk about this important issue. Mr. Speaker, excessive and burdensome regulations have become a pattern under this administration, and it's harmful to business and prevents growth in our economy. One area of concern amongst many that I have and my constituents have in North Carolina is the proposed Environmental Protection Agency rule, which would make changes to the Clean Water Act. The proposed rule by EPA would grant them control over essentially all waters, not just navigable waters, as any common-sense person understands navigable waters, and which is clearly defined in the Clean Water Act of 1972 and has been upheld by the Supreme Court. But in North Carolina, farmers who are a critical part of this economy and community, earlier this week I had the chance to meet with a group of farmers from Wayne County, which is a large population center in my district. And one of their greatest concerns was not a traditional farmer concern that you hear. It wasn't a concern about feed prices or soil fertility or farm equipment maintenance. It had to do with a federal agency attempting to regulate any ditch, puddle, or dry creek bed within their property lines. And this proposed rule from EPA would take away control from these farmers and place it in the hands of a federal government bureaucracy. Now, the EPA claims that it needs the authority to do this, but in reality, this expansion of power would unnecessarily put local and state issues in the federal government's hands. The EPA wants to expand the jurisdiction to intrastate waters, which could include isolated streams or ditches. This is extremely consequential to private property owners who could now be subject to EPA regulations even if they merely have a small pond in their backyard. Mr. Speaker, if the EPA is given this authority, private property owners will be vulnerable to lawsuits from environmental groups for not complying with the regulations. And in some of these cases, these waters have nothing to do with federal interests, and the rule could override state prerogatives. The rule would allow the EPA to regulate activities beyond the scope of interstate commerce, which is clearly not what was intended by the Clean Water Act when it was passed in 1972. It's essential that we support policies that help farmers, not only in North Carolina, not only in my district, but across the country, to grow and produce their crops. They cannot afford to be laid low by overreaching government regulations. These are not large corporations. We're talking about local farmers who are farming sweet potatoes or soybeans or tobacco. And for them, these new regulations can be complex, and compliance can be time-consuming and expensive. Mr. Speaker, the Small Business Office of Advocacy has reported that federal rulemaking has imposed a cumulative burden of $1.75 trillion on our economy. We should not add more to the problem with the proposed EPA rule, but rather we should be doing all we can to alleviate the burden on our farmers, small businesses, and our nation's economy. Again, I want to thank the gentlelady from Missouri for organizing this hearing this afternoon, and thank her for her time. I yield back.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, and I wanted to follow up on just your exact same story. I hear the same from my farmers in Missouri, and this picture here on this poster, I hope everyone can see, because I want to show you what Representative Holding was just talking about. The Clean Water Act gave the EPA authority to regulate navigable waters, and that's the pictures here. There would be something you would consider navigable water, and they work with the Army Corps of Engineers to develop regulations for that. The picture on the right is what I consider non-navigable, and I think most people with common sense would. They're farm ponds, they're puddles, they're ditches. And this is what EPA is trying to expand its reach to regulating. And as Representative Holding said, it was so true, this is going to impact every farmer, every property owner, and it is a violation of property rights. The government should not have any control or say over how people manage their ponds. Or if there's a puddle in the field, they shouldn't have to ask permission to be able to plant a crop there. And yet that's what you have, one of the things that EPA is doing. So thank you for bringing that up, and I wanted everybody to just see an opportunity of how ridiculous this really is and what an overreach of government is. So thank you very much, Joe, for showing that picture. Now I'd like to turn to my friend Andy Barr from Kentucky, and he knows a little bit about coal, I know, and a lot of the other impacts of EPA. So please share with us your thoughts on this topic.
Well, I thank the gentlelady and appreciate her leadership and for organizing this special order and her leadership in highlighting a real problem in our country right now. You know, the President of the United States